Hello, I'm Hale Esfandiari. I run the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you and welcome our three speakers. We started the Middle East program 17 years ago with a meeting on Iran, and our speakers that meeting were Elaine Sholino from the New York Times and Shaul Bakhash. And 17 years later, I'm chairing my last meeting today, again on Iran, as the director of the Middle East program, but I'll stay at the center as a fellow. And I was talking with our speakers and telling them that I don't, starting next week, I don't have to worry whether we will have a large audience, a small audience, whether our speakers will show up, not show up, whether the situation will change from when we sent out the invitation. So for me, it really is a special privilege to have with us today three top experts on Iran who have spoken in the past a number of times at the Wilson Center, and I have had the privilege of always, whenever I have invited them to come and speak, they accepted my invitation. And this is really a special privilege for me. We have distributed the bios of our speakers, Wright, Suzanne Maloney, and Kareem Sadjadpour. We have just an hour, so I will stop here and turn the floor to Robin. Each of our speakers will speak for 10 minutes. I will start the first questions, and then we will open the floor to your questions. Today we are going to deal with an assessment of Rouhani's 2 years as president. I mean, the focus of his presidency, of course, has been on the deal. But I think what is also of interest is the changes he has been introducing domestically in certain area. And Robin just came back from Iran, so she will give us our impression, and then you want to touch on the nuclear deal too, you should, and then we will move on to Suzanne and to Carrie. Robin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Holly. First of all, I just want to say we are extraordinarily privileged to have worked with Holly. She has been the mother, the nurturer, the supporter, encourager, in every possible way. She has worked with hundreds of scholars at the Wilson Center. She's done extraordinary work in creating this program and making it one of the most important in the country. It's a tribute to her that so many turned out today, and that she is a household name when it comes to Middle East issues. So I'm honored to be on her final panel. I'm also honored to be with Suzanne and Kareem, whose work I have extraordinary respect for. Let me just say, I've been to Iran 3 times in the last 18 months, and I've been covering Iran now for 42 years. I first went there in 1973. And it's quite extraordinary to see the pattern of change, particularly in the last 18 months. I'm a journalist by profession, so I speak in bottom lines. So I'll give you 10 headlines. The first is, I think that Iran has, under Rouhani, stabilized. There are not the wild gyrations, the wild uncertainties of the Ahmadinejad years. I think that's reflected in the kind of temperament, the political temperament in Tehran. There's a sense that people don't want to go through again the gyrations of from the reform era that became controversial to a hardline era that in which people became afraid of aspects of daily life. I think it's reflected in the economy as well, and I'll leave most of that to Suzanne, but I have to say that people talk about the psychology of the economy produced by Rouhani, that there has been a sense that that he has made an effort to deal with issues of corruption. He's made an effort to deal with the overspending, the issues of subsidies, with some pretty bold steps, including the increase of gas prices by 40% overnight. And so anyway, there's a sense that Iran is trying to deal with more realism rather than ideologically with some of its problems. And when I went to see Rouhani's chief of staff, he made a point of talking about their two priorities are dealing with, domestically, are dealing with rule of law, getting back to the rule of law, and dealing with corruption. And I thought it was also reflected in some of the honesty with which they're dealing with social issues. Iran has announced the opening of 150 alcohol treatment centers in a country where alcohol is banned. So I thought, again, that kind of reflected the realism. The second bottom line is that I think the opposition during Rouhani's first 2 years has been contained. Now, there is an important caveat, which I'll add down the road. But I think largely because of the nuclear initiative, the Supreme Leader has repeatedly intervened on behalf of the negotiators in pushing back the hardliners who are trying to create diversionary issues with which to pressure Rouhani, not specifically related to the nuclear deal, but whether it's the attempt to impeach one of Rouhani's cabinet ministers. So far, he's survived those attempts, most of them anyway, and push back when there's been criticism of the nuclear team. It's interesting that Parliament has not created as many of the tensions that it could have on the presidency. I went to Parliament and talked to several MPs, including hardliners. I talked to the chairman of the Foreign Policy and National Security Committee, and I was struck by how everyone, for the time being, doesn't want to see sabotage of a deal. They want to say they're all for a deal. Of course, it's what are the terms of the deal. But the kind of language is not as volatile as I had expected. The third bottom line is that fragile equilibrium is probably temporary. That the kind of realism, the beginning of stability, and it's only the beginning, is not likely to last. Iran's political rivalries are robust. And I think you saw that last night when a group of principalists walked out of the iftar banquet hosted by President Rouhani. For the first time, he brought together rival political groups, reformers and hardliners. And when the former mayor of Tehran, Karbashi, got up and gave a speech mentioning Prime Minister Mousavi and former Speaker of Parliament Karoubi, who both ran for the presidency in 2009 and have been under house arrest since 2011, and called for their release, a number of the principalists got up and walked out. And that, I think, reflects the kind of undercurrent of tension that is still there. It's being masked at the moment by an attempt to show unity on the nuclear program. And I think, ironically, that if we get a deal, you'll actually see the opposition being given more of a voice to try to reassure the principalists that the Rouhani government is not abandoning the revolution. My fourth bottom line is that I think public expectations of change under Rouhani, unlike the early euphoria, have ebbed, and that there is less of an expectation that whether it's a nuclear deal or the first term of Rouhani is going to produce the kind of openings that a lot of people had hoped for, whether it's in freedom of speech or women's rights, that in a lot of different levels, expectations have been lowered. My fifth bottom line is that Rouhani's government, I think, has prepped for a deal in looking at what happens next. They've spent a lot of time exploring what they want to do if they get a deal and if they have options to deal with the outside world. I think they've done a significant amount of homework. I went to see the deputy oil minister, and he talked about the plans they've made for $200 billion of foreign investment in oil and gas products. How they're hoping to get at least another 700,000 barrels a day per day of oil out there within a year. That they are very aggressive. They've been talking to a lot of their partners in the international oil community, as well as bringing in dozens of foreign delegations, many of which have not been there in a decade. So I think they've been very practical in looking and in making preparations. My sixth bottom line is that I think that when we look at what Rouhani, again, is preparing for the aftermath, what's next, that their top priority is actually getting beyond the nuclear deal and dealing with the region. They really are very nervous about the crumbling Middle East. One official talked to me about how 100 little mini-states in the Middle East would be very much against Iran's interests. That ISIS has changed the equation. I think there is actually even a new realism about dealing with Syria and what the solutions are, and I'm happy to talk about that if anyone's interested. There's a lot of talk about Yemen, and I think that relates in many ways to their relationship with their Gulf neighbors. That was their priority. Zarif, on his first major trip as foreign minister, went to the Gulf. President Rouhani went to the Caucasus. They really were trying to reach out to the region and change the kinds of relationships that were existed under Ahmadinejad's presidency. And I think the danger is that Saudi Arabia, being one of their first priorities, has turned out to be a source of greater tension than at any time since 1987, when 400 pilgrims were killed during a pilgrimage to Mecca, when there were protests and ended up being confrontations with Saudi security forces. The seventh bottom line is that Iran may have only the veneer of democracy, but it has enough democracy that it's trapped in the same election cycle that we are. That they are looking already at what comes next. And I think that has really consumed the political environment for the last 6 months. They've been laying the groundwork, a lot of the political groups, to find candidates who can run in the parliamentary elections that are scheduled for February. After a decade of hardline control, there's a sense among centrists, moderates, reformers that there is an opportunity here, and they're laying the groundwork to flood the Council of Guardians with candidates, so many that they can't all be declared unqualified. My eighth bottom line is related to that, and that's just as pivotal as a parliamentary election, and that's the fact that the election will also be about the Assembly of Experts. And again, when you talk to people in Iran about what they're concerned about, they're really looking at this political moment. You have these two elections that have not always in the past been held at the same time. This is a moment when the Supreme Leader has had prostate surgery. He's now, just if you look at actuarial charts, he's now in his mid-70s, that there's a sense that the election for the Assembly of Experts will define what group of people select Khamenei's successor. And so this is a moment that, when it comes to Parliament, will affect the domestic agenda, and when it comes to the Assembly of Experts, will define the kind of leadership Iran will have and what the limits will be in the next era. The ninth bottom line is that the deep state is just as deep as it was under Ahmadinejad. Last year I went to hear Rouhani give a speech on press freedom, and I was really struck that he sounded very much like President Khatami. He used the same overtures about giving the press an independent voice and how important they were and being a critical component in society. And yet the regime has engaged in yet another round of arrests of social media activists. There's actually a committee that looks at what's out there in cyberspace to control, to confine, to contest the attempts to talk more openly about political issues, social issues in Iran. And of course, the arrest of Hassan Rouhani reflects the dangers to the press, both foreign and domestic. My final bottom line is that I think 35, 36 years after the revolution, the Iranian society is far less interested in the revolution than it's ever been. It's much closer to having the concerns of a normal society. The focus is not on the heady debates about the ideal Islamic State. They're really on much more basic issues like the terrible pollution in Tehran, the water shortages that have led to the drying up of the largest lake in the Middle East, which is in Iran, the fact that 4 of the most polluted cities in the world are now in Iran, that there's some very practical issues that are consuming them. And I think that reflects, going back to my very first point, and I'll end here, the sense that there is an underlying realism, at least within society, and that noise reaches into the political strata and I think even up into the Supreme Leader's office.
Thank you, Robin. Suzanne?
Thank you very much, Hale, and thank you so much for the honor of being part of this occasion. For those of you who know Hale, you know just how central she is to the work in Washington on Iran and on the broader Middle East. For those of you who are just getting acquainted with her now, I cannot tell you how important she has been to my own career, to everything that I think we discuss in Washington on the issue of Iran. And she will be deeply missed, but we are pleased that she will actually stay on and have more time for her scholarship now that she has less administrative responsibilities on her shoulders. It is really a privilege to be here, and especially to be with Robin and Kareem, whose work on Iran I have admired for many years. I was asked to say a few words about the economy, and I think they'll actually dovetail very nicely with Robin's final closing point. Although I have not had anything like the direct exposure to Iran that she's had in recent years. I've been following Rouhani's government since his election as part of a project on trying to understand the prospects for moderation in Iran. And I think the economy is really a very important piece of this. I watched last August on near the anniversary of his inauguration when he gave a speech in southwestern Iran, and of course this was a time of tension in the broader region, and he talked a lot about what was happening in Gaza. And he was greeted with a chance to open the tunnel, to destroy the tunnel. And the implication for many who follow the international media is it had something to do with Gaza and the tunnels that have provided an avenue for funneling weapons and other goods into Gaza. In fact, it was a much more prosaic issue. It was about a domestic parochial concern about a tunnel and an infrastructure project that the government was planning to undertake. And for me, this sort of underscores the challenges that Rouhani faces. He's got to manage, as Robin said, this very intensely competitive political system. He has to extricate the country from the nuclear impasse with the international community, and at the same time, he has to fulfill the needs and aspirations of a population who, as Robin said, are no longer mobilized by revolutionary rhetoric, by the ideals of an Islamic State, but in fact are looking to the government to resolve much more immediate expectations of jobs, inflation, and living standards. And I think this is the legacy of a political system that has been increasingly predicated, its legitimacy increasingly predicated in terms of economic performance and delivery of services to its own people. That's a very positive dimension, I think, of what has happened in Iran. And if there were anyone to lead Iran at this particular moment, at a time when government performance and performance legitimacy were really the core fundamentals of the system rather than religious ideals, I think Hassan Rouhani is, in fact, perhaps the ideal person. This was his moment, and it is perhaps why it is that he somewhat surprisingly came to the fore 2 years ago after a very interesting election and managed to capture a plurality in the first round. He's someone who I think consistently has looked at national security through the lens of economics, that effectively prosperity and growth are an essential component of national power. It's a debate we have here in this country as well. But if you watch Rouhani's career, he's had a career obviously in the parliament, career in the national security bureaucracy, and particularly on the nuclear issue. And then even his time in the political hinterlands during the Ahmadinejad administration, when he was effectively on the outs with the supreme leader, and one of the most early, frequent, and vocal critics of Ahmadinejad's policies. He often couched his opposition in terms of the impact on the economy, the drive for the nuclear program, and the seeming disregard for the referral of the file to the UN Security Council, and what it would do for Iran's economy. And so this is, I think, it's important that he's taken office at this time, and I think that, in fact, what we see is someone who has been, even in his time in office, has really taken on the economy as sort of his central issue. He spoke at a conference that one of his key advisors organized in January called the First Iran Economics Conference. And he actually, I think, made a fundamentally important statement. He said, in our country, it has been years and decades that the economy pays subsidies to politics. They say that subsidies cannot be forever, and of course this is actually a policy issue for Iran that I'll talk about in a moment, and someday it must be stopped. But what he's talking about here is effectively what governs Iran's decision making. Should Iran's decision making be governed by revolutionary ideals and aspirations, or in fact, should, as he said, the economy pay subsidies to politics, or should our foreign policy actually help our economy? Should our political system actually help our economy? And this is the case that he made, and I think this is the way that he's governed since he's been in office. And he's been very outspoken on a number of different issues in this speech and a number of other speeches, talking about opposition to monopolistic powers, talking about concerns about corruption and rent seeking. He's actively pushed back against the role of the Revolutionary Guard in Iran's economy, which was a kind of hallmark of the Ahmadinejad era. He's also, of course, talked about the importance, the connection between economic prosperity and the social situation of Iran's, of the regime's legitimacy. And so I think that what you see is someone who really is bringing to the fore, and perhaps it's kind of a culmination of some of the talk that began during the reformist period, of how one sequences change within Iran, how economy can actually help political change, can actually help with Iran's international outreach, and I think Rouhani is a very important indicator of that. He's been helped by two sort of broader societal trends. One is that I think, in general, the sort of polarization within the political system on economic policy has diminished tremendously since the early years of the revolution, and even since prior efforts to reform and moderate Iranian domestic and foreign policy. And there I'd point to both the Rafsanjani and Khatami experiences. Rouhani doesn't have the same kind of opposition, the same kind of powerful voices for more socialist economic policies that both Rafsanjani and Khatami faced, and in particular that were responsible in part for some of the undermining of Rafsanjani's efforts to reform the economy. So this has been, Rouhani comes at a moment where he represents much more of a national consensus about rational economic policy, market-based economic policy, being something that isn't profoundly contested by powerful political actors within the system. So that's a huge advantage for him. I think the other advantage is that, in part, perhaps because of the experience of Ahmadinejad, there is a little bit less sensitivity to the potential social implications of some of the policies. For years, if you talk to people in the Khatami administration and others on the kind of reform side, or even those around Rafsanjani, they constantly said, look, we'd like to reform our subsidy policy. We'd like to deal with some of the really big burning issues, but we can't. We have to be concerned about the social base. We have to be concerned about our ability to be reelected. You still hear people talking like this, and yet in part because of some of the somewhat bold and disastrous moves of Ahmadinejad to reform subsidies and undertake some other changes in the economy that didn't provoke the kind of social uprising that many had anticipated for many years. I think that what you see is a Rouhani administration that is more willing to take a gamble. And so, as Robin said, this decision to raise gasoline prices by 40% and also eliminate the sort of lower subsidized rate and this very complicated smart card meter system for purchasing gasoline was something that I think certainly the Khatami administration probably would have been very loath to undertake because of the concerns for what it might mean in terms of people on the street. In office, Rouhani has kind of emphasized the fact that, look, he didn't quite appreciate how bad things were. This is a standard policy. We've heard it from other Iranian leaders, and frankly, we've heard it from people here in Washington. He came in at a time with 45% inflation rate and a government that had effectively burned through the biggest oil boom in history. And much of that money, tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars, have simply been spirited out of the country and will probably never be recovered. But what Rouhani did is put in a really experienced group of technocrats and try to implement a fairly careful balancing act. He didn't want to institute true austerity policies, but he needed to rein in liquidity, he needed to get a handle on inflation, and he needed to, in fact, impose some greater fiscal discipline within the government. And he managed to do that without triggering a recession, without sending the economy into a tailspin. He has brought the country back from, I think, the really dire economic position that it was in at the time of his election. He has brought inflation down from 45 to 15%. He has stabilized what had been a sort of economy in a huge careening decline of devolution of about 6% negative economic growth to now just barely positive economic growth. And the expectation is, of course, with a deal and with sanctions relief, that the economy would be poised to grow quite well. The reliance on sort of focusing on Ahmadinejad's failures has some practical value. He can go in and sort of look at the subsidy reform policies that were implemented by Ahmadinejad and tinker with them in a way that has some potential social implications. He's trying to push many of the people off the rolls of the cash payout system, who don't really need the money that they're getting every month. And obviously, it's easy to sort of pin the blame on some of those policies, pin the blame on Ahmadinejad. He's also made major changes and effectively stopped the Mehr housing project, which was another one of the sort of big cash sinks of the Ahmadinejad administration. But at the same time, it raises the fundamental question for me, and I think for many others, about how to manage and fix the Iranian economy. That's almost irrespective of sanctions relief. If you look at what happened during the Ahmadinejad administration, ultimately the president and the executive branch are not the fundamental final decision makers within Iran. And effectively, someone was asleep at the wheel. And the failings of the Ahmadinejad administration can't simply be pinned on one bad and incompetent and dangerous president, but really on the system itself, because it's a system in which accountability can be circumvented, in which there are multiple layers of bureaucracy and authority, and that in and of itself, I think, will make the challenge for Iran, even in the aftermath of a deal, that much more complicated. One final word just on the oil situation. The sanctions have impacted the oil industry and the energy sector profoundly, as you know, both in terms of the possibility of exports and in terms of the ability of the sector to actually engage with the international industry. There's a huge amount of optimism about what's going to happen in the aftermath of a deal. The possibility for Iran to reclaim its market share, to regain the levels of oil exports that it had prior to the revolution, or prior to the imposition of the really intense sanctions. It's going to be as potentially dangerous as it is, as much of a challenge as it is an opportunity, because of course, as Iran begins to return to oil markets, it will have both the economic challenge of managing that sort of expanded supply within the market in a way, but also the geopolitical challenge, which brings it back to the issues that Robin raised about Iran's interest in focusing on the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Kareem?
Thank you, Hale, and thank you all for coming. I want to also just say what a privilege it is to be here on a historic day, on Hale's last day here in DC, and to share the stage with Suzanne and with Robin. The very first time I was ever invited to speak in DC was 10 years ago this month, and it was right here at the Wilson Center. Hala's invite. I was based in Tehran then, and we were talking about the election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Since then I've had the privilege of sharing the stage with Hala many times, and we've been on the PBS NewsHour together many times, and I'd actually dedicate all 10 minutes of my remarks just to how much I admire Hala, but she would be upset by that. But let me just share one anecdote from my childhood, which I think wonderfully captures my relationship with Hala. When I was about 13, my childhood idol Michael Jordan scored his career high 69 points against the Cleveland Cavaliers. And his teammate that evening, Stacey King, scored 2 points. And Stacey King was being interviewed after the game by a reporter, and he said, "I'll always remember this as the night when Michael and I combined for 71. So I'm proud to be Stacey King vis-a-vis Hala's Michael Jordan, because she really, as Suzanne said, has made such a peerless contribution to the study and understanding of Iran over the last 2 decades. So, one of the few lessons I have learned about the Middle East over this last decade is that this region, the Middle East, is a graveyard for empires. It's a graveyard for forecasters, anyone who tries to predict the region's future, and it's a graveyard for optimists. So with that, let me try to make a few forecasts about Iran's future, but I'll try not to be too optimistic. And Robin made 10, and she has much more insights than we do these days. So let me make four or five. I can't tell if I'm going to make 4 or 5, but one of the two. So the first point is that for me, Hassan Rouhani is the equivalent of the gambler that goes to the roulette wheel in Las Vegas and puts all of his chips on one single number, which is the nuclear deal. He's put all of his efforts on the nuclear deal, and I think that his logic is sound in thinking that if the overarching priority of the Iranian people is to improve their livelihoods, you have to get this nuclear deal solved and to get the sanctions removed in order for that to happen. So based on that, he hasn't really made that much of an effort to pursue human rights or the improvement of civil society. But I think that he'll be one of the very few Iranian presidents since the 1979 revolution to be able to have this tangible achievement if the nuclear deal is in fact reached, which I think is pretty likely. But I'd also say that the nuclear deal will essentially be Iran digging itself out of a hole which they themselves created. This isn't launching Iran into the G20 or the equivalent of one of the great economies. I don't even see Iran really going back to the time when I was based in Iran prior to 2005, when oil exports were quite high, over 4 million barrels per day, and there was a very vibrant, thriving civil society and thriving press. I think what would be achieved with this nuclear deal is undoing the damage of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, but I don't see it really launching Iran forward, at least in the near term. Second point is that there's a lot of hope that after a nuclear deal, the more moderate forces within Iran, civil society will be strengthened, they'll be emboldened, and I think there is something to that. I think they will certainly feel the wind in their sails. At the same time, I think it's very likely, and we've actually already seen signs of it, that the hardline forces, the intolerant forces in Iran actually increase repression to show the population that don't think that our external flexibility is indicative of internal weakness. And I think the reality about the Rouhani government, Rouhani himself, Zarif, is the fact that they're actually going to be beholden to these hardline forces, including within the Revolutionary Guards, I should say, namely within the Revolutionary Guards, to actually implement and enforce the nuclear deal. So I actually think it's going to be very difficult for Rouhani to go after the Revolutionary Guards and try to clip their wings, because he's reliant on them to enforce this nuclear deal. So I think as always in Iran, people's expectations are likely going to be unfulfilled, because I think he's in a very delicate position. It's going to be difficult for him to challenge them head on. The third point is about the supreme leader, who, in my opinion, is the greatest Machiavellian politician in the Middle East of the last quarter century. Khamenei, after Sultan Qaboos of Oman, is now the second longest serving autocrat in the region since 1989, so it's 26 years. And Sultan Qaboos is, likely in his last months or years. And it's quite remarkable when you consider the fact that this guy, for the last 26 years, first he started as a very weak leader. And for the last 26 years, I assume he's gone to bed every night and woken up every morning thinking that the greatest superpower in the world would like to see him no longer ruling Iran, the United States. And much of his own population is not thrilled about him ruling Iran. And he's been counted out so many times over the years. Hashemi Rafsanjani, the guy who was his kingmaker, the guy who made him supreme leader, was once considered the most powerful man in Iran. And we see how Khamenei has really outmatched Rafsanjani. When Khatami was first elected, Mohammad Khatami was first elected in 1997, he had massive popular support, and everyone thought, including myself, that Ayatollah Khamenei's future was very dim. He eventually outlasted Khatami, who is prohibited from leaving the country now. And under Ahmadinejad, people had predicted that power was shifting towards Ahmadinejad and the Revolutionary Guards, and Khamenei remains on top. So I say this simply because the modus operandi of the supreme leader has been to wield power without accountability. And in order to do that, he needs a president who has accountability without power. And I think the expectation that Rouhani is going to be emboldened by this nuclear deal and is going to start challenging the leader, I think won't be borne out. We've seen that Rouhani and Zarif they've actually given credit to the supreme leader for this nuclear deal. It's unlikely they're going to challenge him, and I think what's more likely is that you'll see the supreme leader gradually try to weaken Rouhani, whether that's tipping the balance against him in the 2017 elections, or before that, the parliamentary and Assembly of Experts elections, tipping the balance against kind of the more moderate forces, or waiting till his second term and just kind of emasculating him the same way he did in the Ahmadinejad and the Rafsanjani and the Khatami presidencies. And the last point I'll make is to accentuate something that Suzanne talked about, which is really in my opinion, the task which Rouhani is trying to complete, which is reconciling the national interests of Iran and the revolutionary ideology of the Islamic Republic. In my opinion, these are two irreconcilable pursuits. If your goal is to put your national and economic interests first, the slogan "Death to America" doesn't make any sense, right? You want to have relationships with the greatest economy in the world, not call for its demise. We haven't seen any signs of that. I think likewise, pouring tens of billions of dollars into Damascus to keep the Assad regime afloat, or to continue supporting Hezbollah. If your goal is the national interests of the country, the economic interests of the country, these pursuits don't make much sense. We haven't seen any change in those pursuits. And then, finally, as I mentioned on some of the social issues, the one that gets a lot of attention just because it's so obvious is the hijab for women, as being one of kind of the ideological pillars of the Islamic Republic. And it's true, and I'm sure maybe Robin, in your New Yorker piece, you're going to write about how the hijab keeps going backward and backward and backward, but it's still there. And I think that there's only so much that Rouhani can try to reconcile these irreconcilable differences, because I think that as he tries to push too much against these hardline forces, they're going to push back against him very hard. So let me stop there and look forward to the questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all three of you. I would like you, either all three of you or one of you, to talk about briefly really, because we don't have much time left, about the human rights record under Rouhani. It has been dismal. On the average, one person a day has been executed, according to the Human Rights Watch. report. And how can Rouhani get hold of the judiciary in order to control, this excess of human rights violation in Iran?
I'm curious, when you were in Tehran, how people talked about that. Has it gotten worse? Has it gotten better?
I mean, it's a great question, and I don't have an answer. We actually, the Human Rights Report, U.S. Human Rights Report, is being released in half an hour, covering the whole world, and of course everyone will be looking particularly at the Iran chapter. It is true. I mean, the judiciary has been the obstacle of anyone who's tried to introduce any kind of change in Iran. It was during the Khatami's era. And it's been fascinating to watch how the revolution has devoured its own children. When you look at the fact that Khatami not only can't leave the country, he's not allowed to be quoted by the press now, former president of the country with a huge mandate. Rouhani's two children, one, his daughter, who was a member of parliament, was charged with actions, against the revolution. His son was sentenced this month or last month to Rafsanjani's son. Yeah, we're charged with corruption and again something against the revolution. Two vice presidents of Ahmadinejad have been charged in the last 6 months with crimes. That there's not an administration that has not paid a price, with whether it's family members or senior administration officials. Khatami's brother was deputy speaker of parliament, and he's married to Ayatollah Khomeini's granddaughter, and he went to the airport, Imam Khomeini Airport, named after his wife's grandfather, and had his passport revoked. He couldn't leave the country. He's a kidney specialist, and he was going to a conference in Istanbul. And so, the judiciary is the kind of principlist or hardline check on any kind of change, on human rights, on political openings, freedom of the press. It's not the traditional criminal and civil courts. It is the revolutionary or Islamic courts that have been the vehicle to crack down and be the check on any openings. And so, I don't see any prospect, again, because the context of all of this, whether it's a nuclear deal or the elections or the discussion of the economy and how much you open up, is really the survival of the revolution. And I think this is where you find a real gap between the majority of the population who, Kareem talked about civil society. I mean, the focus is less on civil society today, it's on startups. I went around to see a whole bunch of the startups, and it's really impressive that there's a different kind of debate going on that's totally separate from that generation, now in their late 50s, 60s, and 70s, most of them on the top end of that, who were the revolutionaries and want to hold of that, want to hold of the principles of the revolution, don't want to see the 18th largest country in the world be reintegrated. They are proud of the fact that they stand against East and West. And most of the population wants to be part of both East and the West. There's just a different vision. And so it plays out most of all on the issue of the judiciary and, of course, human rights issues.
I would just say that one of the great tragedies in today's Middle East is the bar for civilized behavior has been set so unbelievably low. When you have 260,000 casualties in Syria, or you see the carnage that we do in Yemen and Iraq and elsewhere, the behavior of the Iranian regime looks Norwegian in comparison. I mean, when you talk about increase in political prisoners or executions and things like that, it just doesn't get the attention it deserves, because within the context of the region, it's not as bad. And what Robin said about the startups is true, at least from the outside. There was just a huge meeting that was held in Berlin about the Iranian startup scene, and my friends who are based in Tehran, 10 years ago, they were animated by issues of civil society and potential for democracy, and now it's Tehran becoming the new Silicon Valley. But again, I really believe that people have unrealistic expectations about what's possible. I mean, if you look at Silicon Valley, it's thrived because of a level of tolerance and openness, which certainly doesn't exist in Iran. So I think that what's happened in Iran since 1979 has been this pendulum where people have unrealistic expectations and then disillusionment, and then unrealistic expectations, disillusionment. And I think that before this nuclear deal, there are unrealistic expectations about how it's going to change Iran, and it's likely going to be followed by disillusionment. But one thing I think it is true, and it came out in the analysis of everyone, which is that given how people were crushed in 2009, and given what they see happening elsewhere in the Middle East, I think they've resigned themselves to the fact that this regime is around. It's not going to collapse anytime soon, and the pace of change in Iran is going to be slower than what we like.
Suzanne.
I'll say a very quick word just on the startups versus human rights, or startups versus civil society. And it's just a reminder, Iran is a really rich country. And I think we focus so much on the impact of sanctions, which has been devastating in many sectors of the economy. But this has also been a decade of tremendous oil revenues. And while much of it was sort of frittered away on unproductive programs or stolen, there's a lot of money in the economy. And I think that this is, part of how Ahmadinejad managed to succeed in the first place, by capitalizing on the sort of populist expectations and desires. And it's part of how Rouhani hopes to sort of overcome the domestic challenges, that effectively I suspect he's going to let the kind of abuses that we see today and have been part of the system since the beginning continue, because ultimately he believes that what he can do is sort of bring Iran to a more prosperous place and bring foreign investment into the country, and that will satisfy much of the population. And it might just be a bet that works. I would be very hesitant to predict one way or the other.
We have 10 minutes for your questions. Can I ask you to be very brief, please? Yes, please. Yes.
Yes, Phil Schrafer. First of all, kudos to Halle for facilitating so much excellent reporting on Iran, and secondly, having been on the wrong side of the prison walls in Iran. I guess my question is to the panel in general. I listen to a lot of WMAL hardline news, and they're saying that the Supreme Leader does not want any inspections of military bases and wants immediate lifting of sanctions. Is this true, and what does Rouhani have to say about that?
I'll take it just real quickly. I think that there's a lot of noise. We're going to hear a lot more noise, that we need to be very careful how seriously we take it. I think there is a full understanding in Iran. They all have acknowledged that they will have to sign the additional protocol, which, if you look at the language, talks about being able to reassure the international community completely. I have a line in a piece I did for the New Yorker earlier this week about the real challenge for the negotiators is defining the difference between complete and everything, and that everything is in the words. And so the Iranians are going to have to agree to it, but they also have issues of sovereignty, and they don't want the international community to be able to go into any military base, any intelligence site, and it's an issue of sovereignty less than the. I mean, they may well try to hide something, I don't know, but the issue is primarily sovereignty. And on the issue of sanctions, look, there are also compromises. I think that's less of an issue. Again, I think in part because the press doesn't know a lot of the tangibles, that they're grabbing onto anything, any comments. And I think I've talked to the Iranian side, I've talked to the American side, and they are at an agreement. There will be a phase 0, and then there will be verification of actions. Then you have phase 1, and you don't have a deal signed until you've gotten through phase 0. It's very clever kind of semantics, but I think that I think there are some real issues. I think this last few days, last week, last 2 weeks, however long it lasts, are going to be brutal. I mean, really brutal, and hard to get there. I think there's chance they will. I think it's going to be tough. But I also think there, on some of the things that the press is writing about, there are other things that are big issues. The UN resolution, and what does lifting the sanctions look like, and what is the UN resolution that replaces it in terms of issues like an arms embargo. I think there are a lot of things that when we get into what happens next, we're focused so much on issues of transparency and sanctions that we're not looking at what will probably be a much more difficult period, and that's how it plays out over the next 10 years.
Can I just say one of the reasons it will be difficult is that the leadership's clearly actively misleading the population on expectations of the timing and scope of sanctions relief. There will be no sanctions relief. At this point, unlikely to see sanctions relief explicitly in calendar year 2015. So when you have the Supreme Leader giving the kinds of speeches that he's given, Rouhani echoing them on the issue of sanctions, you run the risk of a real disconnect between what the population is thinking is coming down the line and what clearly all the politically informed leadership understands is the reality of the deal.
But I do think that people are much more realistic today about sanctions relief than they were a year ago in looking at what was possible. And there's an understanding that the U.S. won't be able to invest, that sanctions will be slower, and so forth. Anyway.
Yes. Just wait for the mic, please.
Mark Landler from the New York Times. To any of the panelists, I'm just wondering, given what's been reported of President Obama's last letter to the Supreme Leader, where he suggested that a nuclear deal might kind of open the way for Iran and the U.S. to work together on other regional issues, it strikes me, based on what all of you have said, that if anything, the U.S.'s relationship with Iran will actually be more tense and more problematic after the deal than it has been in the time leading up to it. And so that's, am I right in saying that? And then the second point is, Kareem was talking about how the sort of notion of death to America as your kind of guiding principle doesn't make a great deal of sense. Will that continue to be the guiding principle in an era in which we're now officially have an agreement with the Iranians on the nuclear program, or is that not as tenable as an operating principle going forward for the Iranians?
Kareem, you take it.
Mark is researching a very interesting book about, touches on this, which I look forward to reading. So since '79, Iran's regional policies have been remarkably consistent. Opposition to U.S. hegemony, as they would call it, opposition to Israel's existence, and rivalry with Saudi Arabia. Even during the era of Khatami, when the president was calling for dialogue of civilizations, Iran was supporting Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad. So there's no precedent that the regional policies would change, and they're going to have a lot more money to pursue those regional policies. So I do think if you're an Israeli or you're Saudi, there are valid concerns about what this nuclear deal might do. That said, since 1979 to the present, the U.S. and Iran have had numerous common enemies, right? USSR, Saddam, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and now ISIS. There have been moments of tactical cooperation vis-a-vis those common adversaries, but it's been at the same time that what I would call strategic enmity has endured, and I would kind of predict more of the same, which leads me to your second question about whether death to America is going to remain the organizing principle of the Islamic Republic. Listen, I think, and Robin knows this better than me, if Foreign Minister Zarif or President Rouhani could push a button and modify that policy, they would. But it's for the ruling elite becomes so much a part of the identity of the system that I think it's going to be difficult to abandon. So I guess the long answer to your question is that I think there can be tactical cooperation vis-a-vis groups like ISIS, but I don't see Iran's opposition to U.S. influence in the region changing it as long as Khamenei remains leader.
If I can just add to that, I talked to a lot of people about both of those questions, and noted that no American goes to church on Sunday and shouts death to Iran. And there's a new restaurant in Iran called the Manhattan Grill, and they serve New Yorker burgers and pizzas and so forth. And the owner said to me, there are 14 million people in Tehran, and there are 100,000 people who go to Friday prayers and shout death to America. And I thought that was telling. And secondly, on the U.S., I think after a deal, you will hear a lot of anti-American rhetoric. The deputy oil minister said we'll shout at each other for 2 months, and then we'll get on with it. that they need to do that for the principalists and to show that they're not abandoning the revolution and so forth. So short term, yes, there will be noise. Long term, I think they're already talking about what they can, areas in which they can do things. Zarif and Kerry have talked about Yemen, and they have made that conversation was important in the first Yemen ceasefire that didn't last. But I think there are places, whether it's the future of Syria or what to do about ISIS in Iraq, that they actively want to see whether it won't be formal cooperation, but it will be, whether it's both American and Iranian forces based in the same place in Iraq, that there will be places where they're doing things that help each other.
Suzanne? Yeah.
I think for the Iranians and for Khamenei in particular, the nuclear deal is not transformational. It's very much about a transaction, and it's a transaction that he's only grudgingly willing to abide by, only if it meets his very specific and particular red lines. So I don't think, as Kareem said, it's likely that we will see any significant change in Iran's approach to any of its regional priorities. It pursues the policies it does in the region because it sees the regime, the system sees those policies in its interests. I think there will be more conversation, more engagement, simply because we now have these avenues of cooperation. But your question about Death to America raises, I think, the fundamental problem that Rouhani has in trying to manage this project of bringing Iran back into the world, is that fundamentally, he can do a lot to restructure the economy, to deal with the mismanagement at home. He can probably unlock the key of sanctions and get much of the sanctions regime over time that doesn't apply to the United States taken away or at least suspended. But what he is going to have difficulty doing is persuading the system that a different relationship with the United States is in its fundamental interest, and that requires adopting all of the other changes that would be necessary to have that kind of a relationship, engaging directly. The reality is it may be only 100,000 people shouting death to America, but if you had 10 people associated with the US government going to an event every week and shouting death to Iran or anything similarly negative, we wouldn't be sitting at the table today. And fundamentally, Iran is going to have to address this issue of its revolutionary ideals if it's actually going to rehabilitate its economy in the world.
We'll take David here. Yes, and then we take two questions together.
Dave Ottaway here at the center. Holly, I first want to thank you for your leadership over the years of our Middle East program, with which I have been associated. It's really been a pleasure to have you as the leader. My question to all of you is, do you see any change in Tehran about whether they're giving up on a united Iraq and a united Syria, and they are beginning to think about how they defend their own interests in a shattered Iraq and a shattered Syria?
Let's take, yes, the lady in the back. Yeah. Short question, please. Okay, thank you.
I'm Saira from Stimson Center. My question is to Robin. You said in your talk that Iran is adopting more pragmatic or realistic policies in Syria or Yemen. Will you please a little bit elaborate on that? Thank you.
Okay.
But David's question was?
United Iraq.
Oh, United Iraq.
Syria.
I think the Iranians are more committed to the current map of the Middle East, arguably, than almost anyone in the Middle East. I think they really are terrified about the breakup of the region. And that's one of the reasons they've, I think, invested so heavily in Syria and Iraq, because they don't want to see both places break up. On the question of more, on their policies on Syria, I didn't say that they've adopted more realistic policy. I think they are prepared to, I think at the end of the day they'll walk away from Bashar Assad. I think that they have a lot of questions about what's next, what are the alternatives. They see a diplomatic solution. They've put a 4-point plan on the table that basically kind of mirrors what the outside world wants, but at the end of the day the outside world doesn't want Iran involved in the solution. I actually think that that one of the great ironies is that after all those years of fighting each other in Iraq, that the Iranians and the Americans actually have common interests when it comes to what's happening in Iraq, more so than many of its own the U.S. own Arab allies.
Kareem?
That's a great question, David, because what's interesting is people who worked very closely on this issue in the United States, including Ryan Crocker, would argue that they believe that Iran is actually committed to the breakup of Iraq. And I haven't seen strong evidence either way. One thing I simply would say is that up until now, I think their mentality, at least in Iraq, has been, if we can rule over the entire country, why just have a Shiite client state? And there are major implications if Iraq breaks into three for Iran's own Kurdish community. 10% of Iran are Kurds, and if they see an independent, thriving Kurdistan, that's something that potentially would unsettle them. And just two last points. One is about something we talked about earlier, which is U.S.-Iran common cause vis-a-vis ISIS. And listen, I think it's an open question whether enlisting the support of Shiite radicals in the Revolutionary Guards and in Hezbollah to kill Sunni radicals actually creates more Sunni radicals than it eliminates. If ISIS is a product in some ways of Sunni disenfranchisement vis-a-vis repression of the Assad regime and the Maliki government in Iraq, if you're cooperating with those Shia radicals to kill members of ISIS, I'm not sure if you're pouring gasoline on that fire or water. And just the last thing I'd say, and Robin knows this very well, just repeating maybe the obvious, which is, it was also the case in 1997 that only 100,000 people would attend Friday prayers, and the vast majority of Iranians were interested in moving on from death to America. The problem is that those 100,000 people are the ones who have power, and they have a monopoly of coercion. So this is one of the lessons I've again learned from the Middle East over the last decade, and it's the best analysis is the piece of poetry from Yeats, from his poem *The Second Coming*, which is the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. And that's unfortunately still the case in Iran.
I think that is a perfect ending.
I think we have people in the overflow, and I have to ask you one of the questions that came, which is unusual. Which think tanks and scholars, since we all represent think tanks, does the Rouhani administration look towards for policy guidance?
Certainly not Carnegie or myself.
None, probably.
Not a question I've ever asked.
American Enterprise Institute.
Please join me in thanking our speakers.
And Holly.